Good evening and welcome to the June 10th Wednesday evening Bible class at the Boone Church of Christ. You've probably heard the term survival of the fittest. What images does that term bring to mind? Probably not images of people putting other people first. Probably not images of kindness. But I'm convinced that Jesus would maintain that caring for others is our key to survival. Research supports this idea. In an article from Psychology Today, there were some things pointed out regarding caring for other people. When it came to contentment in life, they found that sharing with others, rather than having more and more for ourselves, brings about lasting well-being. Talking about marriage, they said that kindness is the most important predictor of satisfaction and stability in marriage. Kindness is a noun. Kindness is shown through our actions. You've probably also heard the term random acts of kindness. There is some validity to that statement, but kindness is really more intentional than it is random. It's easy to see these days in the media and in the streets that kindness is certainly something that is needed. God the Father and God the Son are our models for kindness. And God intends that David's life serve as an example to us as we talk about developing hearts of kindness. Tonight we're going to look at a story in 2 Samuel chapter 9. David is now king. He's on the throne. Saul is dying. Some time has elapsed since David has become king. And so we'll pick up the story here in verse 1 of 2 Samuel chapter 9. One day David asked, "Is anyone in Saul's family still alive, anyone to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" He summoned a man named Ziba, who had been one of Saul's servants. "Are you Ziba?" the king asked. "Yes, sir, I am," Ziba replied. The king then asked him, "Is anyone still alive from Saul's family? If so, I want to show God's kindness to them." Ziba replied, "Yes, one of Jonathan's sons is still alive. He is crippled in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. "Lodabar," Ziba told him, "at the home of Machir, son of Amiel." So David sent for him and brought him from Machir's home. His name was Mephibosheth. He was Jonathan's son and Saul's grandson. When he came to David, he bowed low to the ground in deep respect. David said, "Greetings, Mephibosheth." Mephibosheth replied, "I am your servant." "Don't be afraid," David said. Just think about that term for a moment. "Don't be afraid," David told him. We'll talk a lot about that here in a little bit. "I intend to show kindness to you because of my promise to your father, Jonathan. I will give you all the property that once belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat here with me at the king's table." Mephibosheth bowed respectfully and exclaimed, "Who is your servant that you should show such kindness to a dead dog like me?" Then the king summoned Saul's servant Ziba and said, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and servants are to farm the land for him to produce food for your master's household. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, will eat here at my table." Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Ziba replied, "Yes, my lord the king, I am your servant, and I will do all that you have commanded." And from that time on, Mephibosheth ate regularly at David's table, like one of the king's own sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah. From then on, all the members of Ziba's household were Mephibosheth's servants. And Mephibosheth, who was crippled in both feet, lived in Jerusalem and ate regularly at the king's table. There are two things that we see in David's kindness to Mephibosheth. And the first is that David's kindness came as a result of his own experience with God. God had been kind to David. There are a lot of places in the Bible that we could go to talk about ways that God had been kind to David. Psalm chapter 8, verses 3 through 8 comes to mind. David here is writing about God's creation, and he's reflecting upon the magnitude of it. and he's reflecting on how much God loves him. He writes, "When I look at the night sky and see the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you set in place, what are mere mortals that you should think about them? Human beings that you should care for them. Yet you made them only a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You gave them charge of everything you made, putting all things under their authority, the flocks and the herds and all the wild animals, the birds in the skies, the fish in the sea, and everything that swims in the ocean currents." David looked at the creation. He looked at the skies. He reflected upon God's majesty and his power and his glory. And then he reflected on God's love and concern for David. And it was overwhelming for David. "How could you care so much about me?" David said in gratitude. In 2 Samuel 7:18, God had made a covenant promise with David, and he had told David through Nathan all that he would do for him. How did David react to this? In verse 18, "Then King David went in and sat before the Lord and prayed, 'Who am I, O sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far?'" Over and over, God had been kind to David. And here in the story we had just read, David expressed kindness to Mephibosheth. You know, God has been extremely kind to us too. Sometimes it can be easy for us to focus on the negative in our lives. What do we do? How do we avoid that? How do we turn that around from focusing on the negative to seeing things from a different perspective? Paul had reasons to be negative when he wrote to the Philippians. He was in prison when he wrote that letter. But in that letter to the Philippians, Paul wrote about joy. And he knew, as that letter talks about in the 4th chapter, that the secret to contentment and generosity were the result of focusing on the right things, primarily the result of focusing on Christ. Well, for us, reflecting on the positive things that God has done in our lives should translate into our kindness to others. We also see that David's kindness to Mephibosheth serves as an example of God's kindness to us. What emotions do you suppose Mephibosheth had when he came before David? He was afraid. Remember, David told him, "Don't be afraid." What was that all about? 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4, we see the first mention of Mephibosheth. Saul's son Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth, who was crippled as a child. And now here's the story about how he became crippled. He was 5 years old when the report came from Jezreel that Saul and Jonathan had been killed in battle. Well, if Saul was killed, that meant there was a new king, and that new king was David. When the child's nurse heard the news that Saul and Jonathan had been killed, she picked up Mephibosheth and she fled. As she hurried away, she dropped him, and he became crippled. So that's exactly how Mephibosheth started out his young life, with both feet crippled. See, when a new king came along, it was considered necessary to kill all descendants of the previous king. Mephibosheth was a descendant of Saul. If all of the descendants of the previous king were killed, there would be no way for anyone else to make a claim to the throne. So when Mephibosheth walked in before David, that's what he was expecting to happen. He'd been hiding, and now he's been summoned by King David. He comes before him, expecting the worst. But Mephibosheth's experience was vastly different, wasn't it? Mephibosheth was expecting death, but instead he received life. He didn't die because of his previous association with Saul. Instead, he was given a place at the king's table. Mephibosheth went from hiding in fear to being treated like a son. He was expecting to lose everything, but instead, he was given everything. All of this happened because David was kind to him. David had developed a heart of kindness. In 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 3, the story we read, Ziba and David are talking. And David asked him, is anyone still alive from Saul's family? I want to show God's kindness to them. See, the message in the Bible is clear throughout. We are expected to treat others like God has treated us. And that includes being kind to others. Because like Mephibosheth, we come to God condemned. We come to God condemned in our sin, in our unforgiven sin, and our guilt associated with it. But when we come to God, we receive life, and we are given a place at the King's table. And in all of this, God takes the initiative. Just like David took the initiative with Mephibosheth. He sought him out. God seeks us out in his kindness. So we should seek others out so that we can be kind to them. Remember, we are God's primary instrument to express his love to the world. So how can we express kindness to others? Well, this might sound backwards, but one of the first ways we understand what kindness is to have a grasp of what kindness is not. Kindness is not shown out of necessity or obligation. We have to learn to differentiate between, for an example, an expected custom and an intentional act. If you're invited to a wedding, do you purchase a wedding present to bring it? Of course you do. Why? Well, one of the reasons is because it's customary to do so. Now that doesn't mean that kindness isn't a part of it. Kindness may be a part of it, but kindness is more than that. Kindness is an intentional act. We intentionally seek to understand a need. We take time to listen to people and to get to know them. And doing so can take us out of our comfort zone. We might have to sacrifice a little time with people, a little of our own time that we would rather spend on ourselves. And during the time that we're with them, we have to be fully there. And that can require sacrifice too, because we have to give people attention. Kindness is something that is intentional. Being kind to other people is a commitment, but it's one that pays a massive amount of rewards and dividends for us and God's blessings. When we live like he's commanded us to live, and that includes being kind, it's wonderful for the people we're being kind to, but it's also very good for us. Kindness affects our relationships with other people too. Kindness, for one thing, should be eager to forgive. Eagerness to forgive involves being ready to forgive if someone asks for forgiveness. But it's more than that. It's actively seeking people out, like David did, and like God does for us. Kind hearts are compassionate hearts, and compassionate people are forgiving people. Kindness is being patient with people, patient enough to really listen, patient enough not to be offended all of the time. Paul tells us to bear with each other. That means that we are patient with each other. That means that we have the commitment to be the kind of person God wants us to be, regardless of how they treat us. Kindness builds other people up. Kindness is encouraging people and expressing a gratefulness for them. There's many other things that we could say here. There's so many examples, and I'm sure you could think of more. One thing about kindness is, and this is important too, kindness is a result of who we are as much as it is something we do. Yes, we are commanded to be kind, but we are commanded to become kind people. Kindness flows from a renewed mind. A continual renewing of our mind takes time and commitment. Developing a heart of kindness is intentional, and yes, it requires effort. So the question for each of us is, are we willing to put in the effort it takes to be kind to others? Well, think about it this way. Christ was willing to be kind for us, even though his commitment to kindness cost him his life on the cross. You know, one thing is clear to me. We are a kind congregation. We are kind to each other, and we are kind to other people. So let's make sure that we continue to be kind and that we continue to further develop hearts of kindness. The world we live in really needs God, and the world needs for us to be people with hearts of kindness.